Hello. In the last video segment, we were talking about Western encounters. We were talking about the entanglement of Europe, the Americas, and Africa, and how after 1492 these three continents became much more inter-involved with one another. Today what we're going to talk about is various forms, various models, if you will, of European colonization. First of all, we remember that word, colonization. We were talking about it in a variety of different contexts in that last segment, but what I need you to understand is colonization is a process in which one country, typically a much more militarized and certainly more advanced economy, sends settlers to another part of the world to develop that part of the world. And when I say develop, I mean develop its wealth. So, for instance, what Hernan Cortez and, to a lesser extent, Christopher Columbus did in the aftermath of Spain's so-called discovery of the Americas, they began to send Spanish settlements over there to develop things that were not easily and readily available in Europe, but sold very well on the European marketplace. So colonization is this mother country, if you will, Spain, France, Britain, sending settlers over to the New World in order to develop the New World's wealth and extract it back to Europe. Okay? The other thing I want you to understand is, even though we as moderns have this idea that it was a one-size-fits-all sort of deal, the Spanish model is very different from the French model, and the French model is very different from the Dutch model, and the Dutch model is very, very different than the English model, which was different than virtually any other European power. That's what we're going to be talking about in this segment. I want to point out something else. Establishing colonies was really difficult work, and I also would like to add it was very dangerous work. I mean, the equivalent in our day and age would be sending somebody to another planet. Now, while that's not unthinkable that one day there will be human beings living on another planet, I don't think that there's going to be too many volunteers to say, let me take that maiden voyage, right? Let me go ahead and prove to the world that this can be done. So this was really, really risky business, if you will. But the reason that Europe decides to do this is because the rewards, the benefits of establishing colonies were unimaginable. I mean, you think about the richest countries in the world. You talk about Britain, and you talk about France, you talk about the United States. At some point in their history, they were all colonial powers. It was the colonies, the development of wealth in places like the Americas, Asia, Africa, the Middle East. It was that colonization process that built the powers that you think of today as the richest countries in the world. And I also might add the most powerful countries in the world. It's funny how that works, isn't it? With wealth comes power. Anyway, let's talk about this. And I want to begin with the Spanish, okay? The Spanish are the oldest American colonists to come over here and establish permanent settlements. If you remember me talking about Cortez and some of the other Spanish explorers early on, you know that I was talking about military expeditions. I mean, Hernan Cortez's expedition of the mainland was essentially a military affair. The problem is the Spanish are looking for low-hanging fruit. They're looking for the Aztec treasures, the riches. They're looking to get rich quick. They're not necessarily, starting out anyway, trying to develop the Americas as much as they are just trying to extract the immediate wealth, the gold, the silver, the precious metals, the things that are readily available. Well, obviously, you're going to run out of that. That's a finite sort of thing. Whereas agriculture can be anyway, infinite. The second problem that the Spanish are having is the Dutch and the English and the French. They're all picking apart what is today Latin America and back then Spanish territory. Okay? So the Spanish are losing really key territories that are very, very valuable. And so ultimately what the Spanish begin to do is set up permanent military fortifications. For instance, St. Augustine in Florida traces its roots back to a Spanish military fortification. Now, when they begin to set up these military fortresses, they're doing so for two primary reasons. One, it's about permanently planting the Spanish flag in the Americas and keeping the rest of the European powers out. So it's about protecting one's territory. But the other thing that they're trying to do is they're trying to develop the wealth of the New World. Obviously, you need labor to do this. I mean, labor is key in any process of production. It's the most expensive and the most important part of the process of production. To that end, you need a reliable and, as much as possible, cheap source of labor. So I guess that begs the question, who did the Spanish envision doing the heavy lifting, the grunt work, when they came over and made these fortifications and made the plan and the decision to develop the wealth of the New World? The short answer is the Native Americans. Now think about something. First and foremost, that's going to be difficult considering what smallpox did to the native populations, right? In some instances, it drained the population upwards of 90%. So this is not exactly a reliable labor source. And the second problem that the Spanish would have, and this is kind of common sense as well, it's difficult to convince somebody to work for nothing, or at least next to nothing, make you rich, take orders from you, feed you, and basically become your slave. There's all kinds of really easy ways that the natives had when it comes to resisting. They knew the terrain, the Spanish didn't. So you can understand that the Spanish are going to have their work cut out for them when it comes to procuring a safe, reliable, and plentiful labor force. In the aftermath of the establishment of these military fortifications, one of the things that you see the Spanish begin to do is send over Franciscan monks, okay? Now, the Franciscans were a religious Catholic society in Spain, and their mission in life as a religious society was to convert the native peoples of the Americas into Christianity, convert them into Catholicism, okay? So all the while Spain was developing this wealth, or extracting the wealth, and then sending it to every corner of the world, they were also exporting religion into the Americas. Why? Well, from a Catholic perspective, that's part of what being a good Catholic is about. It's about spreading the gospel, right? It's about converting people to Catholicism. But over the course of time, historians have come to understand that the Franciscans, and religion generally speaking, had a much more beneficial role to play when it comes to the Spanish authorities, the Spanish crown, okay? What the Franciscans are trying to do is completely wipe out the memory of the indigenous religions of the Americas. In other words, wipe out the Aztec religion and replace it with Catholicism. So if you can get them to worship the way that Spaniards worship, if you can make them dutiful Catholics, then it's much, much easier to get them to go out there and do the heavy lifting involved in colonization. If you can get them to eat like Spaniards, to dress like Spaniards, to ranch like Spaniards, to farm like Spaniards, all of a sudden these Native Americans are not doing all this grunt work simply because the Spanish are telling them so at gunpoint. They're doing it for the glory of Spain, and, when you convert to Catholicism, you're one step closer to becoming Spanish. So religion and Catholicism, generally speaking, served a very important role for the Spanish crown when it comes to getting the native population to do what the Spanish wanted them to do, okay? It's a form of coercive labor. I'm not necessarily going to call it slavery, but it was certainly in the realm of getting people to do something that they wouldn't ordinarily do, okay? I'm hopeful that that makes sense. Now, in instances where you continue to see resistance among the native people, whether that be resistance to Catholicism, not completely embracing the doctrine of Catholicism, or whether it just be rebellion generally speaking, the Spanish dealt with the indigenous populations excessively harshly. There's one instance in what would later become known as Santa Fe in New Mexico, what is present-day New Mexico, where the indigenous population simply said, we've had enough of it, and they decided to revolt. They killed several Spanish soldiers, and as their punishment, I guess you would call him the governor of Santa Fe, ordered the right foot of every adult male over the age of 25, that right foot to be cut off. So you can see that if you got out of line, the punishment and the reaction of the Spanish was excessively harsh. So for your notes, New Spain was very draconian and very harsh when it comes to its treatment of the native population, and that's all being done in the name of the extraction of wealth. Let's move on and talk about the French, okay? In 1534, a Frenchman by the name of Jacques Cartier sailed across the Atlantic and claimed for France what you call northern and eastern Canada, places like Newfoundland and the future French territory of Quebec. They traced their roots back to Jacques Cartier, who had established what would come to be known as New France. So for your notes, New France is the northern and eastern part of what is today Canada, okay? Now, there's something I'd like you to understand about the French when it comes to colonists. The French king at the time, Louis XIV, he couldn't give land over here away. I mean, he simply could not find takers to entice Frenchmen to come over here as colonists and settle the New World and develop these colonies. He could not convince anybody to come over here and do this. Now, although that might be the case, what the French were able to do is set up very extensive, complex, and lucrative trading networks when it comes to the Native Americans. Think about the topography, how the environment looks in eastern Canada. Very woodland, lots of lakes, lots of rivers, lots of streams. And when the French came over, one of the things that they noticed was that the Native Americans were very skilled hunters and very skilled trappers. They noticed that Native Americans used animal furs in their day-to-day life for a lot of different reasons, okay? Now, we are talking about a time, I mean, Paris, you know, has always been one of the capitals of the fashion world, and it certainly was back then too. And one of the things that had become very fashionable in France was animal pelts. Things like fox and mink, they were very expensive to buy. They weren't necessarily readily available, and those French migrants, the few that did go over there, understood that this was going to be a good business, so they saw a really good opportunity to trade for fur with the Native Americans. Okay? Let me tell you a quick story that I think is going to stick with you and will really define how the French approach colonization over here. One of the things that the French used to trade for furs with the Native Americans were beads, just like any little bead, shiny, and they were plentiful in Europe. You could get them on any street corner in France. But as far as the Native American was concerned, these are like diamonds. Nobody had seen anything like this, so they were very valuable for the Native American standpoint. Now, when the Native American would wear a fur, they would wear the animal's fur on the inside of the coat. In other words, closest to your skin. If you've ever gone to the zoo and seen an otter, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. The fur of the otter is very coarse, it's very hard, it's even kind of oily, and it's designed to keep all the weather, all the moisture out. So naturally, when a Native American would harvest an otter pelt, they would put it on the inside facing their skin, so that would help keep out all the things that you didn't want to get you cold. Well, think about wearing a coat day after day after day. It's got to get worn down, isn't it? Right? And when it got worn down, the otter pelt got really fluffy and really soft. But when the Frenchman saw this, he saw a really valuable coat. Now, the Native American is thinking to himself, you know, I've got to get myself a new coat. This thing's getting worn down. You know, the pelt isn't keeping out the water the way that it once did. So he's thinking about throwing it away and buying a new one. Along comes this French trader who offers him a fistful of beads for the coat that the Native American was going to throw away anyway. And the Native American's thinking to himself, let me get this straight. You want to give me a fistful of what I consider to be diamonds for a garbage coat that I was going to get rid of anyway? I'm going to laugh all the way to the bank for that, right? But at the same time, you have to understand that the Frenchman thinks that he's taking the Native American for a ride because he's offering him something that he can get anytime, anywhere, and he's getting a coat that he can sell for goodness only knows what on the Parisian marketplace. So my point with this French fur trader story is both sides walked away happy. Right? Native Americans like the Iroquois appreciated the French. First of all, they were a good trading network. They offered things that you couldn't get in northeastern Canada, and they weren't very many in number, so you never had to worry about them taking over your territories the way that the Spanish are taking over territories in the Southwest. Okay? Now, over the course of time, what you begin to see the French trading with the Native Americans for is not always beads. In many cases, it becomes firearms, weapons, guns. Okay? Now, it's not as if the French are doing this intentionally. The Native Americans see something that, like most human societies, that could really enhance one's political power locally and maybe even beyond that. And so when the French began to trade guns for furs, the same thing that happened in Africa when the Portuguese were trading slaves for guns began to happen in the Americas. In other words, a series of vicious civil wars. And over the course of time, what you had is the Iroquois that are just going to war with everybody in their general vicinity because they want to dominate trade with the French. And the only way that you can do this is by suppressing your neighbors. You got to give the French what they want, which are animal pelts, and in exchange for those pelts, you're going to be not only getting a lot more weaponry, you're also going to be the most powerful force within your general region. So understand that the French involvement in the Americas was beneficial, but you should probably qualify that benefit. Okay. Lastly, we need to talk about Jacques Marquette. Now, Marquette is, to put it succinctly, is another French colonist, and he is sailing up and down this river in North America that I bet you've heard of, the Mississippi River, and he's sailing from north to south. Okay, so think of the northern Iowa, Minnesota, the Great Plains region, and move south, and ultimately he ends up in the present-day city of New Orleans. Now, as he goes down the Mississippi River, he does two things. One, he develops new and additional Native American trading partners, which is funneling all of this Native American produce back into France, and it's making France very, very wealthy. The second thing that he does is he claims that territory for France. Now, the king of France at the time was King Louis, so naturally what Marquette did was he named that massive territory, think of it as north and west of Louisiana, the present-day state of Louisiana, he named it the Louisiana Territory. Okay? Now, this is going to be important later on in the 19th century when Thomas Jefferson buys the Louisiana Territory from Napoleon Bonaparte from France. But nonetheless, this is Louisiana, and it's part of the French Empire in the New World. The last group that I want to talk about today would be the Dutch. Okay? Now, in terms of the geography, New Netherland, which is a way of referring to the Dutch, the Netherlands, Northern Europe, we're talking about New York, and I'm talking about the metropolitan New York City, New York. New Netherland would be considered places like New Jersey and the eastern chunk of New York State. So that's for the geography, that's New Netherland. But the capital of New Netherland would be a place that the Dutch referred to as New Amsterdam. The capital of the Netherlands was Amsterdam, so naturally they called the capital of their American empire New Amsterdam. You call that New York, as in New York City. And if you think about New York in this day and age, what that is the financial, economic capital of the world. And one of the most important reasons why is it had a grade A, arguably the best harbor in the world. Maybe Los Angeles has a little bit better one, but you see what I'm trying to get at here. Anyway, there's an enormous amount of wealth that is coming into New Amsterdam, and it's making the Dutch Empire exceptionally, exceptionally wealthy. Okay? Now, in addition to all of this commerce that's coming into New Amsterdam, the Dutch are getting a taste of all of it. In other words, you're having to pay an import-export duty for anybody that wants to do business in New York, very similar to how New York City functions in this day and age, okay? But the other thing that I want you to understand is the Dutch are also developing New Netherland the same way that the Spanish and the French are developing their empires elsewhere in the Americas. For instance, the Dutch are trading extensively with the Native Americans for things like furs and other things that could not be procured in the European marketplace, even though they had excessive amounts of value there. So anyway, for the most part, the Dutch approached their relationship with the Native Americans the same way that the French did. It was mutually beneficial. But one thing that I do want to point out, when the Dutch forced the issue with Native Americans, in other words, when they demanded the use of a strip of land or a waterway, something that the Native Americans didn't necessarily want to part with, the Dutch were nowhere near above the idea of the use of military force. So in that sense, they were very coercive when they needed to be, the same way that the Spanish were. But at the same time, they had this mutually beneficial relationship with the Native Americans the way that the French did. So the Dutch, New Netherland generally speaking, was kind of a combination of the two. Now, I'm hopeful that what you take away from this lecture is that there are very different fashions of European colonization. There's no one-size-fits-all. And when we get to the English, we're going to see that they're really different in terms of the way that they approach colonization. But whether you're talking about the French or the Spanish or the Dutch or the English, what I do want to leave you with is European contact with Native American societies would completely and forever change Native American life in the New World. In some ways, these changes were good, but in many ways, in a lot of different ways, they were very, very bad. Not only do you have the issue of disease that is draining the population the way that the smallpox epidemic in the Southwest did when the Spanish showed up, you see civil wars like the ones that were set off with the French and the gun trade. You see conquest, what we were talking about with respect to the Dutch. And lastly, when we get to the English, you'll see that the English spread out. They populate what is today the Maryland and Virginia areas in a speed that was unimaginable as far as the Native Americans are concerned. So whether you're talking about the French, the English, the Dutch, the Spanish, whatever European group you're talking about, in many ways, you could almost say most ways, Native American life was worse off than before European contact. That's where we're going to leave it. And as I've already alluded to, when we come back, we'll be talking about the English colonies in the New World.